Hello everyone and welcome to the second lesson of the Web Development Foundations Bootcamp. In this one, I'll be showing you how to work with HTML forms. Now, HTML forms are simply used to collect user inputs. You can see forms everywhere around the web, even on web and mobile devices. For instance, you can see the Facebook login page where it asks you for your email and your password. This stuff is a form. You can see it contains a text input, a password input, and also a button to submit the form. And HTML provides you with different elements that can be used in conjunction with a form. And here is another type of form, in this case, a search form. So with this one, you can actually send a search query. And most times, these user inputs are collected and sent to a server for processing. Forms are everywhere in software applications. You can also see the comment form. This is also a form as long as it collects input from the user. Same thing with the contact us form and so on and so forth. So this is what we're going to be working on today, and I'll cover the basics and the essential information you'd need to get comfortable working with forms. We won't be talking about styling since this is the HTML section. When we get to the CSS section, you'd learn how to style forms too. For this lesson, you can create a folder on your desktop or you can continue working with the previous folder from the previous lesson. So for this, I created a new folder called Lesson 2, which is today's lesson. And inside it, I created an index.html file. From the previous lesson, you know what this file does, and you also know the basic structure of a HTML file. Now, let's get working. The first thing I did on this file was to update the title to HTML forms, and you can see that right in the browser, in the title section. To create a form, we use the form element, and you just type in form and press enter. It asks you for an action, but let's leave that for now. The first element we'll be working with is the input element. For this demo, I'll just be creating a basic sign-up form. So the first item I'll need would be the username. Let me create that now. The input element simply creates a text box for the user to type in data. Let me save that and see what it looks like. And you can see it over here in the browser. This is a basic input form. Remember, from the first lesson, I talked about self-closing elements, or also called void elements. These are elements that don't have content inside them. Rather, they have the opening tag and a bunch of attributes to control and configure them. So, for this input, we say the type to be a text. Let's go over to the browser and type in. As you can see, it collects text values. We also have different types of inputs values. The next one I'll cover would be the one for the password. So I'll go ahead and create another one. And even before I do this, when I type in inputs, you can see Visual Studio Code gives us a list of different input types thanks to the IMET abbreviation. You can see we have input for button, input type for checkbox, date, and so on and so forth. I'll be covering some of this later down the demo. For now, let's create the input for password. So I'll change the type from text to password, and I'll save my work. And you can see over here, the first input collects text. Let me zoom this in. While the second input collects password values. And this closely mimics the Facebook login page, and you can see the password also similar to ours. So this is the password input. First thing you'd notice is that these input elements are inline elements. From the previous lesson, I talked about inline and block elements, where I mentioned that the heading elements and also the paragraph elements were examples of block elements. And this simply means that a block element takes up the whole line, while an inline element lines up the elements side by side. In this case, you can see it is clear that the input element is an inline element. To change this up, we can wrap this element using a paragraph tag, or we can also use something called a div tag. Let me use the div tag to show you what it means. And you can see a div tag is a block element. We'll be using div tags as we progress down this learning path, but I won't be sticking too much using div tags because these are not semantic HTML. From the previous lesson, I mentioned that semantic HTML simply means that you could get what they do clearly from the name. In this case, body is an example of semantic HTML. Also, form is an example of semantic HTML because you can see over here, from the tag name, you can understand that this is a form. But divs are just simply a way to divide elements across your web pages, and they don't really tell what that portion actually means. So, most beginners use div tags aggressively, but I'll be showing you more of semantic HTML when we get to styling with CSS. For now, you can see the div element doesn't contain some spacing and all as compared to the paragraph. So I'll change the div tag to the paragraph tag and also paragraph tag and save my work. And you can see prettier complaints because of the opening tag is different from the closing tag. I need to change that up now. There was really no need for me to open up Prettier to read the error message because I could see the error right away. So I saved my work and you can see we have the input text and also the inputs for the password. Now, if we refresh this page, these input elements are not really descriptive because you don't understand what value you'll be expecting. If you go to the Facebook sign up page, you can see there's kind of like a placeholder for the email address or phone number and also a placeholder for the password. This helps with accessibility for users visiting your web page. So let's add the placeholder for the input text and password. Save our work and we come back over here and you can see we get kind of like a description of what we are expecting. So over here we have the username and over here we know we are going to pass the password in this field. Now, if you don't want to go with this approach of having the placeholder, you can have placeholder and also labels for corresponding inputs or form elements. I'll go ahead and add a label for both the username and the password inputs. By default, the label expects a for attribute, which tells the label the inputs or the form element it is referring to. In this case, I want to refer to the username input, but as you can see, there's no way of uniquely identifying the username inputs. And this is where IDs comes into play. IDs in HTML are used to uniquely identify elements in your web page. For this, I'll give the first input an ID of username. Then we can reference it in the label's for attributes like so. Then inside the label, I'll give it the content of username. Save my work. And you can see the label appears. So this label is for what? The username input, as simple as that. Label for username. And the value of the for attributes must match with the value of the ID attributes of the corresponding inputs. Let's go ahead and do that for the password field. Save your work and you have it. The label field also comes with cool accessibility features. So for instance, if you click on the label, it automatically focuses on that particular input. So if you click on password label, it automatically focuses on the password field. Same thing for the username label, and it focuses on the username input field. So that is one of the built-in features of using a label with inputs. Now, the next thing you might be asking yourself is, how do we submit this form? So for that, we'll be using a button. So I'll add that up. So we have the opening tag of the button, the closing tag of the button, and also its content. But the button also comes with some attributes. For instance, we can specify the type. In this case, I want this to be a submit button. So when I save this up, I have the submit button. When we click on the submit button, an additional question mark is added to this, which means this current page is processing this form. But I want you to notice something. We submitted an empty form, and this is not actually what you need whenever you have a form. In most websites, You wouldn't be allowed to submit your form if the fields are empty or if it expects a required field. HTML forms comes built in with some validation features, and this is known as client-side validation because this validation is done on the client side, which is your browser. Let's add some attributes. So the first one we'll be working with is the required attribute. So let's add that for both the username and the password field. Save the work. Now I click on submit, and instantly you can see some validation on the browser. So when we click on submit, it says, please fill out this field. I can fill out some name, and if I submit, it says, please fill out this field, because why? The password field is also required. So if I also type in something, I could click submit, and the page processes this. Now, you're not just limited to the required validation. You can also add more. For instance, you can say the mean value should be 6. So the mean characters for the password should be 6. And if you notice, instantly, our code is formatted, and this is thanks to Prettier. In the previous lesson, we set this up, so you should know how this works. Formatting simply makes your code easy to navigate. So instead of having a long infinite horizontal line, Prettier automatically brings in the attributes to the next line to make our code easy to navigate. All right, let's save our work once again. There's no need to reload this since we have live server running already, but I'm just reloading it because I'm used to that. Let's submit. It asks us for this field, and let's enter a password of probably 4 characters and click submit, and it works. And why is that so? Let's try again. The form submits, which simply means there's something wrong. So probably this attribute is not actually the correct one. So I'll just place my cursor here and type Control and space to see the autocomplete feature of Visual Studio Code. And you can see min is not actually the correct one. Instead, the correct attribute is min length. I'll select min length and save my work once again and type in 4 characters and click on submit, and instantly you can see an error message which says you need to lengthen this text to 6 characters or more. Client-side validations could come in handy for you depending on your use case scenario, but one point you should always note is that you should always do your client-side validation, and you should also validate data on your server side, which is your back end, because you can't just trust data coming in from the client side. So when you do your validations in the front end, you should also do the validations in the back end for safety and security reasons. You could further explore more of these validation features. For instance, you also have the max length, but I won't be covering that. You go ahead and play around with that, and I'll also share a resource where you get to see a comprehensive list of these attributes. Now, the next one I'll cover quickly before I move on would be the email field. So for example, I could just copy and paste this and change this to email. This time around, I change the type to email and save. So if I submit, it says required for the username, or let me just comment out this username. I comment out using the command and the / keys. Then I come over here and submit. It says, please fill out this field. Now watch what happens. If I fill out this field, immediately the client-side validation kicks in and says that this does not conform to an email. And why is this so? I want you to take a look at the source code and tell me why. If you said simply because of the type is an email, then you're correct. So the input elements are intelligent enough to pass in the corresponding validation based on the input type. If I change this to number, for instance, and save, automatically you can see this component now has some controls for different numeric values. So I can't even type in alphabets into this. So you just have to play around with these different input types to see how they work. So I'll remove this, or I'll just undo. And right on. Now, one thing I want to point out is, before we move on is how this form is being processed. Currently, when we click, let me remove this question mark. Currently, when I fill up this form successfully and submit, the question mark is appended to the URL, which simply means this HTML page is responsible for processing this form. In a normal scenario, most forms are sent to the back end for processing. And this is done through the action attributes. If you hover over the action attributes, you can see this is the URI of a program that processes the form information. At this point in your development journey, we'll be processing it using a simple file. So I'll head over to, I'll put it now, success.html. Then I'll create this file. Or before I create it, let's submit the form and see what happens. Let me take this up. Change this back to use the username. So let me submit this form and see what happens. It shows us something, which means it cannot get this file to process. And why is that so? If you look at the file structure over here, we don't have a file called success.html, so the browser complains. And this leads us to the next step. If you have something like this, most of the times, whenever you save your work on your browser and you see a different value or it does not work correctly, the first thing to do would be to check Prettier. And if Prettier doesn't complain, you should also check your source code. And if you can't figure out anything, you should come to what? The developer tools, also known as DevTools. So let's right click on the browser window and select inspect. Then already you can see we have a red icon here which shows an error. So I'll head over to the console and you can see here it says failed to load resource. The success.html server responded with a status of 404 not found. What is this gibberish number 404? To have a clearer understanding of what is going on, I'll go to the network tab. Let me reload this page once again. And you can see we have an error over here. It says success.html cannot get success.html. And you can see over here, the request method is get, and you also have the URL. So the 404 status code is a HTTP code. Now, what is HTTP? HTTP simply stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And HTTP is a protocol for fetching resources such as HTML documents. For example, whenever you click for the full URL on a website, you can see it has HTTPS, and this S simply means secured. We won't be covering what this means at this point of a development journey because you'll be learning more about that when we get to backend or server-side development. But for now, HTTP is just a protocol for fetching resources such as HTML documents. If you also go to this site and you come to the URL, it also has this HTTPS. And now you might be asking yourself, what exactly is a protocol? We mentioned that during the first lesson when we talked about Internet Protocol, which is IP or IP addresses. And now we're talking about Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is used for fetching resources like HTML documents. Now, in networking, a protocol is just a set of established rules that specify how to format, send, and receive data between two or more communication devices, despite differences in their underlying infrastructure or design. Now, what does all this gibberish mean? What this simply means is that the HTTP protocol gives you a rule set on how to format and how to send response messages depending on different scenarios. In this case, whenever a resource cannot be found when using the HTTP protocol, it sends a 404 status code, which simply means this resource cannot be found. We also have different codes for different scenarios. So if, for instance, we go to the index.html file, we know that this file can be found. And you can see over here, when we click on index.html, the status code is 200, which means everything is okay and good to go. You'll be dealing with all these HTTP and HTTP status codes when you get to your backend development journey. But for now, this is just the basic meaning of what is currently happening. So let me fill my form once more and submit and press submit. You can see the error is self-explanatory. Success.html is not found. So what do? We go ahead and create it. So let's do that now. So right now, we don't have the error again. And if we go to the console or the network tab, currently in the console, we don't see any error because everything is working. If we go to the network tab and reload this page, you can see success.html now returns a 304 status code. And if you do a simple Google search on what 304 means, the HTTP 304 not modified redirection response status code indicates that there is no need to transmit the requested resource. So, you know, previously we submitted this form and it brought us here, but if we remove this question mark and we just come directly to this place and do a refresh, we click on success.html and we have a 200 status code. Now, previously when we submitted the form redirected us to success.html, but this time around, if we are coming directly to this success.html file, we get a 200 status code, which means we are coming directly into this file and not being redirected from some other resource. So if I reload and type in username and password, before I hit the submit button, what do you think would be the status code of the success.html file? Let's do that now. And success.html 304 not modified, which means this resource came from a redirection and the data is not modified. Not to worry if you don't understand what this means, but with time you get to understand what they mean. All right, let's ride on. The next thing we'll be talking about is the form method. So let's add that attribute. And you can see we have three different types of method. We have the get and the post and also the dialog. But the ones we'll be focusing on is the get and the post. Now, the post method is mostly done when you have a back-end server-side code processing this form. In this case, we don't have a back-end server-side code, so we can use the get method. But before we use the get method, let's use the post method and see what happens. So I save this, and if we hover over this, you can see, let's see, the HTTP method that the browser uses to submit the form. And these are the descriptions. So whenever you get a resource, for instance now, whenever I come to the network tab, go to the network tab, and whenever, let me reload this page, this index.html page, whenever I reload this and click on index.html, you can see over here, the request method is get, because what? We are getting this web resource, which is index.html. For posts is, for instance, if I, like for Facebook, for instance, if I log in and put in my password and I click login, it is going to send a post request because there is a back-end server-side code that is going to get the information of this form and also process it. So that is what post is simply doing. Post appends the form data inside the HTTP request, and you'll see the difference shortly. Let me use posts. I'm currently using posts, which is not going to work, but let's see what happens. And I type in password and I click submit. And as you can see, there is a problem somewhere. So if I click, we can even see first from the console, it says failed to load resource. The server responded with a status code of 405. Let's go to this success.html and you can see what the 405 status code gives us. It says 404 method not allowed, which simply means this post method is not currently allowed in our configuration. And this is simply because everything right now is on the front end code. We don't have a back end server to process data using a database and stuff like that. So that is why it is telling us here 405 method not allowed Which method? The post method. As simple as that. If everything was okay, for instance, it will give you like a 200 status code. If we are redirecting, it would give us a 304 status code. But not to worry about all the status code. These are the basic ones you should just understand, just in case your stuff doesn't work. And the reason we are getting all the status code is simply because of live server, if you can remember. Live server simply creates a local server on our computer, which simulates like if we are really on a web server. Now, let's write on. So the next thing to do would be to remove this method and change it to get and save. Let's go back, refresh, and this time around, I'll put in the username. Let me put in something, John, and the password is some gibberish, and I'll hit submit. And it says form successfully submitted, and I was expecting something here, so let me check my code once more. Normally, when you use the get method, let's go over and get, like, cool. So, corresponds to the HTTP get method. Form data are appended to the action attributes URI with a question mark as separator, and the resulting URI is sent to the server. Use this method when this form has no side effects and contains only ASCII characters. Now, I was expecting the form data to be appended on the URI or URL, but it doesn't do that. And the reason is simple. When you head over to your HTML file, you can see over here we have a label and an input. Now, the label has 4 attributes which corresponds to a ID attribute for a form element, in this case the input. But now, this ID is just uniquely is just used to identify this input element. So we have the ID for username and also the ID for password. But for the form elements, it has to know its children, and it cannot know its children from the ID, because we use this ID just to, for instance, for styling purposes and also for linking a label to an input. But this form element actually needs to know the name of its children. So for this case, the input element has an attribute called name. I want you to notice something about HTML. Most of the attributes and the elements are easy to understand, and they are kind of like self-descriptive, and that is what is called semantic HTML. So from here, we can say the input type is of text, the ID is username, and the name of this input is what? Username. So relating this to kind of like humans, your passport number or your social security number is your ID, and your name can now be John. I hope that makes sense. So let's give the name for the username and also for the inputs of the password. So I'll just copy and paste this and also give it a name password. Now, the name can be different, but in this case, the name can be different from the ID, but in this case, I'm just using this same name for the ID and also the name for consistency. So let's head back, refresh, and resubmit this. And you can see form successfully submitted. And if you look at the URI over here, so the first assignment or first task for you to do on your own would be to get the difference between URL and URI. Do some research and get to see the difference. So let's write on. Now, when we use the get method over here, you can see the get method. Whenever you use this, it appends the value of the submitted data in the URI. So you can see now we submitted the username John and the password is this value. This is possible because of the name attributes on the input element. Now, I want you to ask yourself this. Does this really look safe to you? When you type in, when you kind of like show your username and password, do you think this is the best way to do it? If you said no, then you're correct. So don't use the get method whenever you're passing sensitive data. And I think it also tells us here. So if you hover, Okay. So he said, use this method when the form has no side effects and contains only ASCII characters, blah, blah, blah. But whenever you use the get method, you make sure you are not submitting sensitive data. So in a real case scenario, when creating login forms and passing sensitive information, you use the post method. But for this lesson, we don't have a backend server side to process the posted data. So that is why we're using get just for demonstration purposes. In the real world scenario, you have to use post for it to be able to process this, since post appends the form data inside the HTTP request. Now, this is not cool to actually do this, but I want you to also think like, which scenarios could you want to append this submitted data in the URL? One example would be for search fields. For instance, search fields, I think, does this have search? Okay, cool. Let me use this. So you can see the search field in this website over here. So if I type in JavaScript and I type in search, and you can see over here, you can see the submitted data over here, UTF-8. We covered what UTF-8 is in the previous lesson, and you can also see and query equals to JavaScript. So this is a very good example of appending the submitted data in the URL. If we go back here, you can see whenever you're appending additional information to a URL, you'll start it with the question mark, the first key and value pair, and for corresponding key and value pairs, they are separated with the ampersand sign. So if you have username, password, email, you'd also have something like this. Get the idea. To confirm this, let me just uncomment this and pass in this. So refresh. The email doesn't show up. And why is that so? If you said that the input field doesn't have a name, then you're correct. So let's save that and go back, refresh. You can see you have the question mark, key, value, another key, another value, another key, another value. So they are separated by the ampersand sign. Each key value pair are separated with the ampersand sign. So that is that. Now, I also want to show you other form elements. So let me separate the previous ones using the HR tag or the HR element. If we save our work and we go back, refresh, you can see HR, which simply stands for horizontal rule. That is kind of like a separator. And you can see this is a kind of like a self-closing element or a void element because it has no content. Cool. And let me cover other ones. So the next element we're going to be covering is the checkbox element. You can see this in different forms. Let me see if this one has, okay, yeah, this is an example. Okay, no, this is a radio button, not a checkbox. A checkbox is the one with the tick. Okay. Let's just do it and you get to see what I mean. And this is a checkbox. And let's see, let me add a label. So we have this, you can have more if you want. So these are checkboxes and the values are true or false. So if it's checked, it's true. If it's unchecked, it's false. So these are what checkboxes are used for. So the next one we'll be covering would be the radio button. So this is self-explanatory. When we get to CSS and the building forms, or when we get to APIs and stuff like that, we would be integrating or would be seeing real life scenarios or use cases where this comes in handy. Now, the next one I'm going to be covering is the radio button. So let me just say H for gender, which is a very controversial topic, but let's ride on. This is the radio button. You can be able to select only one from this group, while for checkboxes, you can be able to select multiple since they're unrelated. But for radio buttons, the fields are related to each other. And if you want, I want you to look closely. What do you think is the common denominator amongst these three elements? If you chose the name attributes, then you're correct. So the way these three elements or three fields are linked to each other is using the name attributes. So the first radio button has a name, gender, second one, gender, third, gender. So the browser automatically interprets that you want to choose only one of these three items. Now, the ID, like I explained earlier, is used to uniquely identify elements on a web page. So for this input, the ID is male, the second one ID is female, and the third, the ID is other. But they are all linked up or related to each other using the name attributes. In this case, we give them the same name attributes. You can be able to select only one. We can go on and on with different HTML form elements, but I'll just want to show you one last one before I wrap this up and give you a resource to where you can learn more about this. The final one we'll be talking about is the select form element. So let me create that now. As the name suggests, select. So we give it a name, and in this case, I'm going to give it a name of states. ID of states. And inside the select element, you pass in a list of options with the corresponding value. So this is the select field, and you can see it has this list of value. If you go to the Facebook sign up page, you can see it is something like this. So you can use it to select from a list of value, and you can only select one unless you pass in a different attributes, which I'll show you shortly. So this is what the select HTML is used for. So if you get back here and we select Abuja, Abuja is selected, Akwa Ibom is selected. Now you might be asking yourself, what's the difference between the value and this actual stuff? So for instance, now the value is the data that will be passed to the server for processing. So in this case, you can see we have a lowercase l. So I can even put the text to show as Lagos State. You can see Lagos State is selected. But whenever I'm submitting this form, in the back end, it is going to receive the value Lagos and not Lagos State. So this is the actual value and this is the visual value that we see in our browser. Now, you can only select one, but we can also select, give it default selection. So by default, whenever we reload our browser, the first option is selected by default. I can change this to a different selection. So I could say Akwa Ibom should be selected by default. So if I save my work, you can see Akwa Ibom is selected by default. If you want to go so complex and deep into this, probably in the future when you have the skill, you can just kind of like automatically get the user's location using JavaScript. Then you just display it in this drop down. Then the person can be able to select something different. One way you can use to get the user location would be from the IP address. So my computer or my device has its own IP address, and this IP address is linked to a particular location. In this case, I'm currently in Lagos, so my IP address will be linked to Lagos. So automatically, you can be able to write that code. I know you wouldn't be able to do that now, but I'm just thinking out loud and telling you how it's going to be done. You could get the user's location from the IP address, and if it corresponds to Lagos, you automatically select Lagos whenever the user loads up this form. I also made mention that you can select multiple values. So let's go to the select, which is the parent field. And so you can see the select is the parent and it has a list of children, just like how we have the UL on that list and the list items. So this is kind of like the same thing, a list of items. So let's see if we can select multiple fields. Let's see. Multiple. Okay, cool. You can see HTML is very straightforward because the attributes and the tag names kind of like are semantically related to each other. So you can see now multiple is selected, which means I can select multiple values. But you might be asking, why is it that it's still just selecting one? So to select multiple value, I can click on the one I want and hold down the shift key. Oops, not shift. Okay, command key and select multiple. You can see holding down the command key will give you access to select multiple values. I'll just duplicate this and comment this out and remove multiple, and we get back to this one. This is HTML forms for you. Now, there are lots of different form elements. You can see this is input field, this is select field, this is also checkbox, and you can see authentication over here. Let me make this bigger. You can see this is a more advanced way, but in our own, if we submit it, for instance, you can see this is the one we have provided by Google Chrome. We can as well customize our error fields when we get to working with document object model, which I think is going to be in week 6 or thereabout. And that's going to be a JavaScript thing. But for now, you can see in Facebook, it has custom error messages, and this is an input field. And if I right click and go to inspect, you can go to inspect. Can you see over here? You can see it is an input field if you look closely, input field type text. Then also this one is, and over here they said it's input type text, and it has this, let me see. Can you see it's select, which is what we just covered. It's select with a list of options. So it's not magic. You can see the value is 1 and the display value is also 1. So you can see 1 up until 31st. So that is just forms for you. That is just forms for you in HTML, and this is also a button. One thing I think I did not cover, or I missed out, is the reset button. So we can also have the button type. You can see reset. So I'll say reset. So if I have some value here and I tap on the reset button, it automatically clears the form. So this is another type of HTML button. So I think that will be all for forms. As we dive in deeper, you'd get to see other form attributes. And you'd also have an assignment, which I'll show you shortly. So to learn more about HTML and HTML forms, you can go to w3schools.com. There are 2 websites we're going to be using throughout the course of this bootcamp. MDN, developer.mozilla.com. The guides. Oops, okay. So we have this stuff. So these are the 2 main stuffs we're going to be using. And I'm going to be using this approach so you don't get to be endlessly watching multiple tutorials all over the internet. Most of the times when I have problems with JavaScript or with the browser API and stuff like that, I always use MDN docs because it has references for almost everything you need. So the reason I do this is for us to be able to get familiar working with documentations, because I don't buy the idea of buying multiple courses all over the internet and continuously watching, because you'd end up in something called tutorial purgatory or tutorial hell, where you endlessly continue watching tutorials and you don't get to do stuff by yourself. And that is why we're going to have an assignment, which I'm going to be showing you shortly. So one good way, or one body you're going to have in your learning journey, would be to just bookmark this developer.mozilla.org, and it's going to come in handy for you. Now, the next thing, if you want to explore HTML, you can come to w3schools.com and go to the HTML session, and you can see almost everything we covered over here is contained inside here. So this can be a good reference for you, and for you to also come to this document if you have any questions. You see we've covered comments and all, images and everything. You can see this lengthy stuff is what we covered in these 2 lessons. Now, the next thing I want you to do would be to come to HTML forms and go to input types. Now, there are various input types over here. You can see we've used button, checkbox, color. No, we did not use color, but we've used radio. Yeah, we've used radio. We've used submit. Okay, we did not use submit, but I want you to try that out, because over here we used the button element, but you can also use the input element and pass in the type of submit, and it will also work. So I want you to come to this page and just explore and see how much you can cover. So HTML is not that deep if you understand the basics, but in the real world, you'll be writing HTML a lot, because any web page UI you see is created with HTML. So that is it for this one, and it's time for your assignment. This is the assignment for week 1, kind of like an assignment to practice what you've learned about HTML. The reason behind this assignment is to get you active and not just watch the lessons and you think you understand what's going on. But with assignments like this after every week, at the end of every week, you kind of like get to practice what you've learned, to kind of like solidify the neurons built up in your brain so you'd have a good working knowledge. Now, this is the website, or this is the assignment where you create a website for a fictional restaurant. You give it any name. It's going to have the home page, about us, and the contact us page. So the home page is going to be basic page. It could have pictures of the recipes or the menu for the day, but the contact us is going to have a contact form, and I want you to make use of what the text area form element. We did not cover that in this lesson, but you already have the resource to learn about that. So when you do this, you can write about it on dev.to or medium.com, or you can send me a link on the comment section and I'll check it out when I have time. So this is the assignment, and you can practice that on your local system, or you could use a tool like codepen.io. But for this, I would strongly suggest you use your local system and get comfortable with Visual Studio Code. But codepen.io is where you can like create coding projects so you'd be able to share with other people. So this is a good way, when you're done developing on your computer, you kind of like paste the code here and be able to share with people in an easy to access manner. So that will be it for this lesson, and I'll see you next week when we dive into CSS, which is used for styling the web page. Right now, the web pages look boring. By next week, in the further lessons, we'll create interesting and beautiful web UIs. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.